A child's shoe lies abandoned on a dusty porch. The wooden gate of the Eaton Hollow Creek compound hangs ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside the main house, dinner plates sit on a long table, untouched, covered in a fine film of neglect. No voices, no movement, only the low hum of summer insects around the empty buildings. The compound is silent now, its secrets briefly illuminated and then left in eerie quiet. They called it faith. It was control. To understand how this place fell into silence, we need to go back to the beginning, to rural Kentucky in the mid-1980s, when an ideal of devout living concealed the seeds of a nightmare. This isn't just tragedy, this is horror disguised as normal life, as one observer later put it. To understand why, we must return to 1985, to a secluded hollow in Kentucky's hills where a man named Jonas Eaton began building a world of his own. A solitary log cabin stands along a dirt road in rural Kentucky, much like the secluded Eaton Hollow Creek homestead. In 1985, the Eaton Hollow Creek area was an unremarkable patch of countryside in eastern Kentucky, a place of rolling green hills, dirt roads, and scattered farmsteads. The local community was small and tight-knit, steeped in church on Sundays and neighborly privacy the rest of the week. So when Jonas Eaton, a soft-spoken man with a wife and 3 young children, moved onto an old farm at the end of Eaton Hollow Road, few took much notice. Neighbors saw a family seeking a simple, off-grid life, a modest couple fixing up a weathered farmhouse and tending a few acres of corn and sorghum. Jonas introduced himself around town as a Christian family man who wanted to raise my kids away from the evils of the modern world, as he reportedly told one store clerk. In a region where many preferred self-reliance, this hardly raised an eyebrow. For a while, nothing seemed unusual about the Eaton family. Jonas, then in his mid-30s, attended church sporadically in a nearby town, making just enough appearances to be polite before quietly retreating to his farm. He had an old pickup truck for supplies and sometimes sold produce at a farmer's market, trading friendly smiles but few words. Locals remember his children as well-behaved and quiet, the little ones standing close to their mother, eyes lowered, when in town. It was easy to assume they were merely shy or strictly disciplined in the ways of rural life. Outsiders saw only a self-sufficient household living modestly. The group's true beliefs and practices were kept entirely secret from anyone beyond their property. In those early years, Eaton Hollow Creek appeared to be nothing more than a peaceful family homestead. Behind this pastoral facade, however, Jonas Eaton had larger intentions. He began holding Bible study meetings in his home, quietly inviting a few acquaintances and relatives from out of state who shared his desire for a purer life. By the late 1980s, a handful of additional families had moved onto the property, some pitching old campers or building rough cabins on the land. Neighbors noticed extra smoke rising from chimneys in winter and more hands helping at harvest time, but still thought little of it. The world believed Eaton Hollow Creek was simply a devout communal farm, perhaps a religious extended family, but nothing threatening. People in the county minded their own business. If the Eatons wanted an isolated life, everyone was content to let them have it. The social environment around the compound thus acted as a shield. In a conservative rural Kentucky setting, a man's home is truly his castle, and scrutiny of private affairs is seen as impolite. Local authorities had no obvious reason to intervene. Homeschooling was legal, and Jonas duly filed the minimal paperwork required, listing himself as the teacher for all the children on the farm. The county sheriff occasionally waved to Jonas on the road and knew him as that farm fellow who keeps to himself. In small-town fashion, there was trust, or at least a lack of suspicion, toward this outwardly normal family. By all appearances, Eaton Hollow Creek was a quiet haven of faith and hard work. But appearances, as would soon be evident, were deceiving. Throughout the 1990s, the Eaton Hollow Creek compound maintained a careful double life. Publicly, it remained low-key and respectable. The members dressed plainly but not bizarrely if they went into town, the women in long skirts, the men in work shirts, resembling certain strict religious sects not uncommon in rural America. When curious locals asked, Jonas or one of his older sons would say they were a family ministry or a Bible-based community dedicated to living free of worldly influences. This explanation, vague but benign sounding, usually satisfied any fleeting curiosity. From the outside, there was no obvious cause for alarm, no wild-eyed street preaching, no compound gates plastered with slogans, just a cluster of old buildings down a long dirt lane, inhabited by people who kept to themselves. The community's interactions with neighbors were cordial if minimal. They might lend a hand during hay baling for a next-door farmer or buy feed at the co-op, always polite. A delivery man once recalled that the Eaton children were unusually well-mannered. They'd stand in a line and say "sir" like little adults. No one could have guessed that this extreme obedience was born of fear rather than mere politeness. When a county health nurse stopped by in 1992, offering vaccinations for the kids, Jonas thanked her and turned her away at the gate, claiming firmly that the family didn't believe in modern medicine. The nurse noted nothing amiss beyond a religious preference. Such refusals raised no red flags in a region where skepticism of government intervention was common. Even occasional noises and odd sights from the farm failed to shatter the facade. A distant neighbor sometimes heard strange echoes at night, what sounded like shouting or a child crying, coming from the direction of Eaton Hollow. But the sounds would cease quickly, and no one investigated. Probably just some wildlife or a late-night prayer, the neighbor mused to himself. On another day, a passerby saw a young boy from the compound with a large bruise on his face. Jonas explained the child had been kicked by a mule. In a culture where farm accidents are routine and discipline is considered a family matter, the explanation was accepted without question. The compound had constructed a powerful social camouflage, a blend of piety, privacy, and outward normalcy that deflected prying eyes. Inside the boundaries of Eaton Hollow Creek, however, normalcy had a very different definition. The world believed a peaceful religious farm was flourishing. In truth, a secretive micro-society of control had taken root. Children who appeared merely reserved were, in fact, terrified into silence. Women who seemed humble homemakers were living under an iron rule. The men outside of Jonah's inner circle labored from dawn to dusk, quietly desperate to avoid their leader's wrath. It's no surprise that in a culture of blind obedience protected by fearful secrecy, victims have been silent and afraid. One commentator later remarked when the truth came out. The silence at Eaton Hollow was not peace, it was enforced by design. The facade was beginning to crack, visible only to those living within it. Inside the compound, Jonas Eaton was not the mild farmer that neighbors thought they knew. He was Papa Jonas to his followers, the self-anointed patriarch whose word was law. In private, Jonas proclaimed himself a prophet and the sole interpreter of God's will for the community. Each member, including his wife, their children, and the other families, was required to swear absolute obedience to him. Dissent of any kind was sin. Jonas preached a distorted gospel that placed himself at the center. He taught that to disobey Jonas Eaton was to disobey God. In this closed world, he held the power to bind and to loose, deciding every aspect of his followers' lives. It became a cult of obedience. As one former member would later describe, obedience was woven into every aspect of our lives, a command to obey our religious leader even in how we thought. Jonas wielded scripture as a weapon, twisting verses to justify his dominance. Under Jonas's rule, Eaton Hollow Creek developed a strict hierarchy and an elaborate system of control. He established ever more stringent rules as the years passed. He dictated how followers dressed, where they lived, who they married, even when they were allowed to be intimate with their spouses. The compound's women could not cut their hair or wear pants. The men grew beards because Jonas believed it marked piety. Families were rearranged at his command. Jonas decided which married couples could share a bed and which had to live as brother and sister if he deemed them spiritually impure. Celebrations like birthdays or Christmas were banned outright, along with television, music, and any books other than the Bible and Jonas's own writings. Life at Eaton Hollow was reduced to a steady, monotonous rhythm of work, prayer, and submission. Jonas enforced his rule through a mix of charismatic authority, psychological manipulation, and raw fear. He cultivated an image of infallibility, speaking in a calm, sermon-like tone that brooked no challenge. If any member questioned a decision, Jonas would fix them with an icy stare and in tone, "I speak for the Almighty. Do you doubt the Almighty?" That usually ended any debate. He also instilled a doctrine of secrecy. Members were told that the outside world was run by Satan, ready to destroy them, and thus holy silence must be kept about life inside the compound. Children learned from a young age that to even think of talking about the compound's ways to an outsider was to invite terrible punishment. "If you must tell his faults, tell them to God," was a saying Jonas loved to quote, repurposing a 1950s prayer card that exhorted believers never to criticize their priest. In Eaton Hollow, Jonas was that untouchable priest figure. The result, as one analysis later noted, was a culture of blind obedience, protected by fearful secrecy, where victims remained mute and compliant out of terror and indoctrination. Punishments for disobedience or even minor sins were severe. Jonas employed corporal punishment liberally and ritualistically. Children were beaten with wooden paddles or belts for offenses as trivial as whispering during prayer. One survivor later recounted how the community's K-12 homeschool operated. Children were encouraged to tattle on each other for the slightest infraction. "If I as a boy so much as daydreamed, I'd be pulled out and taken to another room to be brutally paddled," he said. The sounds of those paddlings would echo. "You could hear the loud whacks through the wall. You just sat there hoping you weren't next," remembered a young woman who attended the lessons. Jonas often conducted these beatings himself, or delegated them to a pair of loyal enforcers, typically older men whom he trusted to discipline others. And after the physical pain, there was the emotional control. Those punished had to publicly confess that they had failed God and thank Papa Jonas for correcting them. In this way, Jonas twisted abuse into an act of divine love, reinforcing his role as both punisher and savior. By the mid-1990s, Jonas Eaton's true identity within the compound was clear. He was a dictator in the guise of a holy man, ruling through fear, piety, and isolation. Eaton Hollow Creek was no sanctuary of faith, it was a closed kingdom of control, with Jonas on the throne. The members' lives were completely in his hands. Yet beyond the trees, no one suspected a thing. The social facade held strong even as Jonas's regime grew harsher by the day. Before we continue, a quick reminder. If you value uncovering hidden truths and dark histories like this, consider subscribing to Glen for more real stories told with cold precision. We dive into true horror disguised as everyday life, and your subscription ensures these stories of systemic control and survival reach you. Now, back to Eaton Hollow Creek and the tightening grip of Jonas Eaton's rule. Daily life inside the Eaton Hollow Creek compound was a study in totalitarian micromanagement draped in scripture. The day began before dawn, with the first pale light over the hills. A bell would sound, rung by one of Jonas Eaton's lieutenants, and every member of the compound was expected to rise immediately and assemble for morning prayers. Barefoot children stumbled from their mats on the floor. Women hurried to cover their hair with scarves. They would gather in the main room of the farmhouse or outside in fair weather, where Jonas awaited them with an open Bible. In those dawn assemblies, Jonas's voice was the only sound besides the chirping of waking birds. He would read a verse or deliver a short exhortation, eyes scanning the group to catch any child fidgeting or any adult whose gaze strayed. The slightest lapse in these moments of reverence could earn a scolding, or worse. After a mumbled unison prayer, the community dispersed to their assigned tasks without any of the casual chatter that might accompany a normal family's morning. In fact, Jonas often imposed strict silence for hours at a time as a form of devotion. Children and adults alike were not allowed to speak during certain work periods, communicating only through gestures if necessary. In Eaton Hollow, silence was considered holy and questioning was rebellion. This practice reinforced Jonas's absolute authority. Conversation that wasn't sanctioned simply ceased to exist. Work consumed most of the day. Jonas drew up schedules dictating exactly who did what from sunrise to sundown. Men and teenage boys labored in the fields, tended livestock, or built extensions to the ramshackle barns and cabins. Women and girls toiled in the kitchen, smokehouse, and garden, preparing huge pots of bland communal meals and preserving food for winter. Even the youngest children had chores. A 5-year-old might be tasked with gathering kindling or watching a baby. Children older than a few years were rarely ever allowed to simply play. By the compound's own unwritten law, idleness was sin, and Jonas ensured that every waking moment was occupied. The followers were kept physically exhausted, which left them little energy to think for themselves or to resist. Any display of fatigue was interpreted as a lack of faith. One former member recalled being reprimanded for sitting down to rest. Jonas loomed over him and quoted Proverbs, "How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard?" The man, eyes to the ground, shot back up to his feet and resumed work despite trembling with exhaustion. Discipline was both routine and ritualistic. Beatings were commonplace, administered in what Jonas euphemistically called trials. If a child misbehaved, perhaps whispered to a sibling during silent hours, or failed to recite a Bible verse correctly, Jonas might order the entire community to witness the punishment. The child would be brought to the front after evening prayer. Jonas or one of his deputies would read a stern lecture about the wages of sin, and then the beating would commence. Adults were not exempt either. A mother who secretly gave her child extra food against a mandated fast, for example, might later find herself weeping on the floor after Jonas struck her across the back with a rod. "This hurts me more than it hurts you," he would say with cold irony. In reality, Jonas believed such suffering was purifying. As one writer later observed, for centuries some authoritarian communities legitimized abuse as discipline, and Eaton Hollow was no different. Jonas preached that pain driven out disobedience. According to survivors, he even distorted a Bible proverb into a communal motto, "Spare the rod and you spoil the soul." The punishments often had a performative, almost liturgical quality. Members were sometimes made to punish each other, a parent forced to strike their own child under Jonas's watch, thereby entangling everyone in the collective guilt and silence. Risa Pires, who visited her relatives in the compound as a child, later remembered how children were encouraged to tell on each other for the slightest perceived infractions. One boy would be pulled from class and you could hear the wax through the wall. You just sat there, hoping you weren't next. The atmosphere was one of constant surveillance and mutual policing, which Jonas masterfully cultivated. At Eaton Hollow, everyone was both a victim and, at times, an enforcer of the system, which further bonded them in complicity and fear. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of daily life was the systematic breaking of the individual will. One survivor's testimony described a particularly harrowing ordeal. When he was 9 years old, Jonas pronounced him rebellious for asking why he had to work on the Sabbath. As punishment, the boy was restrained. "A female church member pinned my arms down while my mother sat on my legs and beat me with a paddle," he recounted. The blows fell everywhere, not just on his backside, legs, back, even his feet, but they didn't stop, because Jonas said I needed a breakthrough. "They told me demons were taking me over, so they kept swinging the paddle." The boy's cries were met with shouts of prayer from others in the room, all insisting this violent blasting was driving out evil. After you've been told repeatedly you're unclean, you start confessing to things you never did. "They destroy your will," another former member said of similar ordeals. These sessions could last for hours until the subject finally screamed out whatever Jonas wanted to hear, admitting imaginary sins, declaring unconditional surrender of their mind and will. When it was over, the limp child or adult would be embraced by Jonas, who would softly say, "There now, you're saved from that disobedient spirit. Papa loves you." Through this perverse cycle of terror and tenderness, Jonas cemented his psychological hold. He made himself the tormentor and the redeemer all at once. Every night, the community gathered again for evening worship, often after a meager supper. By then they were bone-weary. Jonas would deliver a long sermon, often rambling, reiterating the special mission of Eaton Hollow, to remain pure and separate from the corrupted world, and to raise a generation of godly children untouched by secular society. In those dim lantern-lit meetings, he sometimes hinted at dark forces outside. "There are enemies who'd love to tear us down," he would warn, without specifying who. This kept the group united against an unseen other. Then they sang hymns in low voices. Bedtime might not come until well past midnight, after chores were done by lantern light. The members would collapse in their bunks, only to be awakened a few hours later for another day exactly like the one before. Life in the compound operated like clockwork, engineered to grind down individuality and enforce an almost robotic compliance. Day after day, year after year, Jonas Eaton's system ran like a cruel machine behind the closed gates of Eaton Hollow Creek. For those living under Jonas Eaton's dominion, escape was a concept that barely seemed real. From the moment new members set foot in Eaton Hollow Creek, Jonas worked to sever their connections to the outside world. Early on, he had confiscated everyone's personal identification documents for safekeeping. Driver's licenses, birth certificates, any papers that tied them to life outside. He centralized all money as well. Members had turned over their savings upon joining, and any income from selling farm goods went straight into Jonas's locked strongbox. Thus, followers quickly found themselves with no IDs, no money, and nowhere to go even if they dreamed of leaving. The physical isolation of the compound, miles from the nearest town, tucked at the end of a road that few traveled, compounded the feeling that the outside world was unreachable. Jonas's indoctrination from day one reinforced that sense of entrapment. He constantly reminded followers of the oaths they swore to God to remain loyal. Parents were taught to tell their children that out there, the devil will get you. Only here are you safe. Most of the children born or raised in the compound knew nothing of modern life beyond its fences. They didn't attend public school, had never watched a TV show or used a telephone, and their only books were religious texts. In effect, they spoke an entirely different language of reality than normal kids. As one survivor, Veronica, later described, hidden from society, we never received schooling or medical care. That lack of exposure meant I didn't even know how to get help. I didn't know what help looked like. This was a deliberate strategy by Jonas. Ignorance was his ally. The less his flock understood about the outside world, the more frightful and alien it seemed to them. Psychologically, many members were bound to Jonas by a mix of fear and a twisted form of love. He was the provider of spiritual salvation in their eyes, and often the only source of validation they had left. Some of those who joined as adults had cut ties with their own families at Jonas's urging, writing letters to parents or siblings saying they had embarked on a holy mission and could no longer be in contact. Jonas cultivated an us versus them mentality so strong that even those abused by him felt that leaving the group would be worse than staying. He told cautionary tales of members who fell away. According to Jonas, one couple who fled in the night a few years earlier had been killed in a car accident that he portrayed as divine punishment. In reality, that couple was living quietly in another state, but the members didn't know this. Such stories kept the specter of doom hovering over any thought of escape. Jonas was not above using direct threats and violence to prevent defection. He owned a shotgun and an old revolver, which he would brandish during his more furious rants. At tense dinner table meetings, it was not uncommon for Jonas to lay his loaded pistol next to his plate as a conversation piece, a silent reminder of consequences. One of his daughters later testified, "For the first 12 years of my life, it was normal for my father to pull his gun on us at the dinner table. He never needed to fire, the message was clear without a word." On one occasion, in 1995, a teenage boy from the compound did attempt to run away. He slipped into the woods at dusk, intending to reach the highway. But the boy's absence was noticed within an hour. Jonas organized a search party of the older men, arming them with rifles. They found the teen shivering in a thicket overnight. What followed became part of compound law. Jonas ordered the boy dragged back, and as punishment, had him tied to a post in the barn for 3 days with minimal food or water. The community was told to shun the youth as he underwent this redemption time. By the end of it, the boy was delirious and sobbing apologies, swearing he would never try to leave again. This example was burned into everyone's mind. After that, no one attempted a physical escape for many years. Even contacting the outside was virtually impossible. There was one landline telephone in Jonas's house for emergencies, but it was locked away, and only Jonas or his top aide could use it, and he monitored all calls. Mail was censored, letters sent out were dictated by Jonas or written under his supervision, and incoming mail was screened. Not that there was much, most members had already been cut off by their outside friends or relatives over time. On rare supervised trips to town, Jonas ensured that different members accompanied each other so nobody was ever alone with a chance to cry for help. And the fear of outsiders was so deeply instilled that, as survivors later recounted, even when a police cruiser would occasionally drive by the property line, grown adults would freeze like terrified statues, praying the officers wouldn't come in. Years of indoctrination had convinced them that any authorities would simply drag them away or harm their children. Jonas had successfully turned the very people who could rescue his victims into objects of dread in their minds. For the children of Eaton Hollow, the compound was the entire universe. They grew up thinking everyone lived this way. A simple car driving past the dirt road was an event to gawk at from behind trees. The concept of running away didn't solidify in their heads because there was no away. Everything beyond the perimeter was spoken of in almost mythic terms, as a wasteland of sin. One young woman, who was born on the compound and spent 20 years captive there, later said, "I didn't even know how to cross a street, let alone survive outside. We were like aliens on our own planet." The longer someone stayed, the more impossible leaving seemed. This was especially true for the women with children. Jonas told mothers that if they tried to escape, they would be caught and their children taken by evil social workers and lost forever. Some mothers admitted later that even in moments of desperation, that threat paralyzed them. "We believed nobody would save us, and that leaving would condemn our kids," recalled one survivor in a TV interview years later. "Nobody saved us," she said flatly, describing her childhood in the cult. "We thought nobody ever would." Trapped by isolation, fear, and psychological bonds, the members of Eaton Hollow Creek remained under Jonas Eaton's control for nearly 18 years. Many of the adults who joined in the 80s were now entering middle age, their youth spent in servitude. The children who grew up never knowing freedom were now teenagers and young adults, groomed to continue the cycle. It seemed the compound might persist indefinitely, unseen and unchallenged by the outside world. Yet, even under this suffocating regime, small flickers of resistance and doubt were not entirely extinguished. A combination of internal tensions and external observations were quietly, slowly stacking the tinder that would eventually ignite into the compound's collapse. As the years wore on, Jonas Eaton's demands grew ever more extreme, pushing his followers to their physical and emotional breaking points. What began as strict discipline and long workdays escalated into outright torture disguised as religious devotion. By the late 1990s, Jonas had become obsessed with the idea of purifying his flock for the end of days. He frequently proclaimed that the apocalypse was near, a divine reckoning that only the perfectly obedient and pure would survive. This apocalyptic fervor drove him to impose new, harsher trials on his followers under the guise of testing and strengthening their faith. One of the most harrowing practices was the introduction of prolonged fasts. Fasting had occasionally been used as punishment before. A disobedient child might be denied food for a day, but now Jonas framed it as a holy ritual required of everyone. In 1999, as the millennium approached, he announced a series of community-wide fasts to prepare for the Lord's return. At first, it was 1 day a week with only bread and water. But Jonas kept raising the stakes. Soon it became multiple days with nothing but diluted vegetable broth. The pinnacle came in the summer of 2000. Jonas ordered a 7-day dry fast, no food, no water, for every member of the compound, including children and even a chronically ill, mentally disabled man under their care. The group had just completed a grueling 3-day fast the week before, barely breaking it before plunging into the next. As one of the women later recounted, "He told us we had to go to a liquid diet so that we would be ready for the rapture, then straight into a 7-day dry fast." The effects were devastating. By the 3rd day without water, people were collapsing during chores. Small children became glassy-eyed and too weak to cry. Jonas's response was to exhort the survivors to pray harder. "He's going to kill them, and they don't realize what he's doing," one member secretly thought to herself as she watched her friends and family wasting away. On the 6th day, an elderly woman lost consciousness and had seizures. Only then did Jonas begrudgingly allow a few sips of water to those on the brink. Miraculously, no one died during that particular fast, but it left the group physically shattered. And yet, when it was over, Jonas praised them. "Your suffering has made you holy," he said. To the loyal, this validated their ordeal. To others, it was a moment of deep confusion and despair, the first time some questioned if Jonas was in his right mind. Jonas's cruelty also escalated in more personal ways. He had always controlled family structures, but now he began to take brides for himself under the pretense of divine command. In 1998, Jonas declared that God had revealed to him that the community needed to emulate the polygamous patriarchs of the Old Testament. Conveniently, this revelation meant Jonas himself would take additional wives. That year, he performed a secret spiritual marriage ceremony with a 15-year-old girl in the compound, a girl he had effectively raised since she was 7 when her parents joined. This teen became Jonas's second wife in all but legal name, forced to share his bed with the full knowledge and helpless horror of her own mother. Over the next 2 years, Jonas married 2 more girls, ages 14 and 12, one of them his own biological daughter. He framed these acts as holy and pure, claiming that these youngsters were chosen to be like the virgins given to King David. The rest of the community, indoctrinated and terrified, largely submitted to these atrocities in silence. But the psychological toll was immense. Some mothers later confessed that they contemplated suicide after being compelled to hand over their daughters to Jonas's predation. Within the compound, incest and child sexual abuse had become organized and sanctified under Jonas's doctrine, unthinkable horrors excused as God's will. At the same time, punishments for any form of resistance grew more grotesque. In one case around 2001, a young mother, Rachel, secretly kept a journal where she vented doubts about Jonas and documented the punishments. She was careless, and the journal was discovered by one of Jonas's loyalists. When Jonas read her private thoughts of despair and her questioning of his leadership, he flew into a rare visible rage. Rachel was made an example of. Jonas convened a midnight tribunal in the barn. In front of the entire community, he read aloud passages of her journal as evidence of the devil at work. As the woman sobbed and begged for forgiveness, Jonas ordered that she be whipped. 2 of his enforcers lashed her with a leather strap 39 times, the number Jonas said corresponded to the biblical 40 lashes save one. The beating opened bloody welts on her back. Several people in the crowd were crying openly, but none dared to intervene. After it was over, Jonas banished Rachel to a tool shed on the edge of the farm. She spent 8 weeks in isolation, not allowed to speak to her husband or children, fed only on bread and water. Each day, members delivered her rations silently and emptied the bucket that served as her toilet, under strict orders not to utter a word or show sympathy. This was Jonas's decree. Rachel would stay in that shed until the demons of rebellion left her. Amazingly, she survived the ordeal. When Jonas finally allowed her back among the group, she was emaciated and weak, but she shuffled straight to him and knelt, thanking him for saving her soul. The others looked on in numb astonishment. Any remaining notion that Jonas might show mercy had evaporated. These extremes of starvation, sexual abuse, and physical torture marked the peak of Jonas Eaton's reign of terror. However, they also planted seeds of doubt and dissent even in some of his previously loyal followers. People were pushed past their breaking points. In whispers and furtive glances, a few began to acknowledge to themselves that this was not God's work, this was simply evil. A clandestine spirit of resistance was brewing. A small group of teenage boys formed a silent pact. If Jonas tried to marry their younger sisters, they would fight. A mother hid a kitchen knife under her mattress, swearing that if Jonas came for her 10-year-old daughter, she would rather kill him in his sleep than allow it. These were dangerous thoughts, and those who harbored them felt immense guilt and fear. But it was a sign that Jonas's absolute control was no longer absolute. The compound had become a pressure cooker of trauma and tension, and even the slightest crack could trigger an explosion. On the outside, too, faint signs of something being wrong at Eaton Hollow were finally emerging. In the winter of 2001, a state social worker received an anonymous tip, likely from the relative of a member who had managed a surreptitious phone call, that children at the Eaton farm were being neglected and abused. 2 deputies drove out to do a welfare check. Jonas met them at the gate, composed and courteous. He allowed the officers to speak to a couple of the children, but under his intense gaze, the kids answered softly that everything was fine. "We're very happy here." The deputies left after a brief look around, noting only that the family seemed unusually private. But one deputy was left with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. He had seen a little girl peering from a window, her eyes huge with fear, before a curtain was hastily closed. He filed a short report about the visit, which went nowhere due to lack of evidence. Yet that thin file remained, a small piece of a puzzle that might have been forming had anyone connected the dots. By early 2002, Jonas's control was at its zenith in terms of brutality, but at its nadir in terms of stability. He had created the ultimate climate of fear, but in doing so, he unknowingly set the stage for rebellion. The humanity he had tried to stamp out in his followers was flickering back to life through their sheer will to survive. Something had to give, and soon it would. The next act would belong not to Jonas, but to those courageous few who dared to break the silence. The first meaningful cracks in the Eaton Hollow nightmare appeared from within. After enduring years of escalating cruelty, a few brave souls in the compound resolved to seek help or die trying. One of them was Sarah Miller, an 18-year-old who had come to Eaton Hollow as a child when her devout parents joined in the late 1980s. Sarah had seen her 2 younger siblings nearly starve in the recent fasts, and she herself had suffered a broken arm at age 16 when an enraged Jonas shoved her for smiling at a memory of her late grandmother. Quietly and methodically, Sarah began planning an escape. She couldn't confide in her parents. They were still true believers and would likely report her thoughts to Jonas, so she acted alone. Late one August night in 2002, when the compound was asleep, Sarah crept out of the bunkhouse where the unmarried girls slept. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would wake someone. The moon was thin, the night sky on her side. Sarah slipped into the tree line and followed the faint path through the woods that led out to the county road. Meanwhile, beyond the compound's confines, outside scrutiny was slowly coalescing. That uneasy deputy's welfare report from 2001 had circulated quietly at the county sheriff's office. Though it hadn't prompted immediate action, a few officers took note of the strange Eaton Hollow group. Rumors also began to spread among former neighbors and estranged relatives of compound members. One of Jonas's own sisters, who had left the group years earlier, had been trying to get authorities to pay attention. She spoke to a local pastor about her concerns, describing Eaton Hollow as a cult where silence was holiness and questioning was rebellion. The pastor in turn alerted a friend in the state police. By mid-2002, a subtle collaborative investigation was underway, albeit with little to go on. Law enforcement lacked an inside witness or concrete evidence of wrongdoing to obtain a warrant. They were, essentially, waiting for a break, someone from inside who could testify to the horrors. That someone was about to emerge. After several hours of stumbling through dark woods, Sarah Miller reached the paved county road just as dawn was breaking. Tired, mosquito-bitten, and utterly unsure if she was making the right choice, she started walking toward town. By providence or coincidence, a Nelson County Sheriff's deputy cruised down that very road on morning patrol. He spotted a pale, thin young woman in dirty clothes waving him down frantically. The deputy pulled over. Sarah, trembling and dehydrated, blurted out, "Please, I can't go back there. I ran away. They'll hurt me." The deputy recognized the surname Miller from the welfare check file and immediately connected it to Eaton Hollow. Gently, he coaxed Sarah into the car and offered her water. What she said next poured out in an emotional torrent. She detailed years of abuse at the compound, the beatings, the forced marriages, the starved children. She begged him to get help for the others still trapped. Later, Sarah would recall that moment. "I was so tired, so I told him the truth. I told him I was scared to go home, and I told him why, and he just listened. He didn't question me or say I was lying." That conversation was the catalyst everyone had been waiting for. It launched an urgent investigation. The deputy radioed for backup and notified his superiors. Within hours, Sarah was sitting in a safe location, wrapped in a blanket, recounting her story to a circle of astonished law enforcement officers. They brought in a social worker and recorded her statement. She spoke haltingly but resolutely, naming Jonas Eaton as the architect of a litany of crimes: child abuse, sexual assault, unlawful imprisonment, possibly even negligent homicide. She told them about the baby's pneumonia death and secret grave. The officers listening felt a chill. It was almost beyond belief that such a situation had persisted for so long right under their noses. But Sarah's gaunt face and scarred arms were evidence enough of the suffering she'd endured. As one detective later said, her condition and the details she gave, "It shocked us to our core." With Sarah's testimony, the authorities finally had cause to act. The county sheriff coordinated with Kentucky State Police to organize a raid on the compound. They worked swiftly over the next 48 hours, fearing that if word leaked or if Jonas suspected something, or if Sarah was somehow missed and recaptured by the cult members, the situation could turn dangerous. There was discussion of the potential for armed resistance. Recall that Jonas was known to have weapons, so they prepared a tactical team. They also arranged for ambulances and social services, anticipating injured or malnourished children and adults. In the compound, those final days before the raid were tense in their own way. Jonas had indeed noticed Sarah's absence by mid-morning the day she fled. He gathered the group and questioned everyone. Panic swirled among the members. Someone had escaped. Jonas's face was a mask of cold fury as he realized one of his flock had slipped his grasp. He confined everyone to quarters and sent search parties combing the woods, but of course, Sarah was long gone. For 2 days, Jonas stewed, paranoid and raging behind closed doors. He told his inner circle that the devil has stolen one of our own and that they must be prepared for trouble. Guns were loaded. Jonas even contemplated fleeing with the group deeper into the mountains, but it was too late. By the time he seriously considered an exodus, the authorities were already en route. The tension inside Eaton Hollow was broken at dawn on September 3, 2002, by the sound of vehicles barreling up the gravel road. A convoy of law enforcement trucks and cruisers converged on the compound's entrance. The plan was decisive and swift. Officers poured through the gate, weapons drawn but aimed skyward, shouting for everyone to come out and lie on the ground. Jonas's reign was about to face the light of day. The raid on Eaton Hollow Creek compound unfolded in a chaotic blur just after sunrise. Law enforcement officers swarmed the property from all sides, determined to secure every building and locate every person as quickly as possible. Shouts of "Sheriff's Department, come out now," echoed against the hills. Most compound members, startled awake and terrified, complied without resistance. They stumbled out of their cabins and the farmhouse with hands raised, some expecting to be shot or struck as Jonas had long warned. Instead, they were met with stern but compassionate deputies who ushered them to sit in the grass a safe distance away. Amid the confusion, children clung to their mothers, and a few began to sob in fear of these uniformed strangers. It was, as survivors later described, like aliens descending. The very people they had been taught to fear were now there, barking orders but also promising, "You're safe now." Jonas Eaton himself emerged onto the farmhouse porch with a shotgun in hand, face contorted in a mix of anger and panic. Officers trained their rifles on him and shouted to drop the weapon. For one tense moment, Jonas's delusions seemed to falter. He looked at the number of officers, there were over 24, and at his followers being led away. Realizing he was outmatched, Jonas slowly set the shotgun down and raised his hands. In that instant, the cult leader, who had towered as an almost godlike figure over his flock, looked small and human. Deputies rushed forward, forced him to the ground, and handcuffed him. Jonas Eaton was under arrest, and his reign of terror had ended. As officers began searching the property, the scope of the neglect and abuse became painfully clear. The living conditions were deplorable. A county detective stepping into the main house recoiled at the stench, later telling reporters, "There were feces throughout the house and large piles of moldy laundry. This was a pretty horrendous case and it does shock you to your core." Indeed, investigators found overflowing buckets of human waste in corners, evidence of punishments involving confinement, and mattresses blackened with years of dirt and no sanitation. In the pantry, they found sacks of spoiled grain and a padlock on the refrigerator, a tool Jonas had used to control food access. In an old root cellar beneath the barn, officers discovered crude makeshift cells, narrow stalls with restraining ropes and scratch marks on the walls, where dissident members had been tied up or isolated. These dark holes testified silently to many unseen torments. Physical evidence of specific crimes also surfaced. In Jonas's bedroom, police found a trunk containing journals and Polaroid photographs, including disturbing images that corroborated sexual abuse of minors. There were marriage certificates Jonas had drawn up for his underage brides, and even a list of dates corresponding to the bizarre fasts and punishment sessions he orchestrated. Out back, a shallow grave was located under a mound of stones behind the garden. With some careful digging, authorities uncovered small human remains, later identified as the infant boy who died of pneumonia years prior, confirming Sarah's account. It was a somber moment as officers realized they were gathering evidence not just of abuse, but of a preventable death that had been covered up. While evidence was collected, paramedics and social workers tended to the compound survivors. They triaged multiple cases of malnutrition, dehydration, and untreated injuries. Children had distended bellies from chronic hunger, and several showed scars from past beatings. One 11-year-old boy had a poorly healed arm fracture. A 6-year-old girl whispered to a medic that her tooth got knocked out when she was punished, and indeed many of her teeth were in terrible condition. The adults were not much better off. Most were underweight, with the telltale signs of anemia and exhaustion. A 55-year-old man, one of Jonas's enforcers, was found to have broken ribs from a work accident that had never been treated. The relief workers were stunned by the scale of human damage. They gently reassured the victims, "You're going to be okay now." "We're here to help." But many of the cult members could hardly process these words. They sat dazed, flinching whenever an officer moved too quickly. It would take time for them to comprehend that the nightmare was truly over. Jonas Eaton was promptly taken into custody and transported to the county jail. Over the following days, the justice system mobilized to hold him accountable. He was charged with a staggering array of offenses, including multiple counts of first-degree criminal abuse of a child under 12, first-degree sexual abuse, rape, incest, assault, unlawful imprisonment, and reckless homicide for the infant's death. In total, the indictment listed over 30 felony counts. Additional members of his inner circle were also charged: 2 male lieutenants for assisting in assaults and false imprisonment, and 1 older woman, Jonas's original wife, Mary, was charged as an accomplice to child abuse for aiding in punishments. The legal proceedings promised to be complex, but prosecutors vowed to pursue justice to the fullest extent. As the news of the Eaton Hollow Creek compound's exposure broke, shockwaves rippled through Kentucky and beyond. Media descended on the small county, dubbing the site a house of horrors and Jonas Eaton a cult leader. To the general public, it was an unfathomable story, a secretive cult in the heart of America's Bible Belt, where a self-professed holy man had terrorized and enslaved his followers for nearly 2 decades. Neighbors were aghast. Many openly grappled with guilt and disbelief. How had such barbarity flourished just a few miles from their homes without them realizing? One neighbor told reporters, "They mostly kept to themselves. I never imagined behind those gates kids were being hurt or women kept like prisoners." The local community hastily organized drives for clothing and supplies to help the survivors, a small gesture to make up for the years of neglect. In the ensuing investigation, authorities interviewed every willing survivor to piece together the full narrative of the compound. What they heard confirmed Sarah's testimony and then some. Former members, now safe, described the systematic mind control and abuse in chilling detail: the starvation, the forced silence, the sexual violence cloaked in religion. Investigators were particularly struck by how long it all stayed hidden. A state report later noted that the belief system's secrecy and the victims' fearful obedience allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. It was a textbook case of a coercive cult. By the time Jonas Eaton's case went to trial in late 2003, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors took the stand one after another, their voices halting but resolute as they recounted years of torment. Courtroom spectators wiped away tears as now 13-year-old Emily, one of Jonas's child brides, described how Jonas had abused her under the guise of marriage. Older members testified how they were manipulated and beaten into submission. The defense attempted to argue that Jonas's actions were protected religious practices or that the witnesses were exaggerating, but these claims held little sway in the face of the stark, incontrovertible facts and the physical scars borne by the victims. After a wrenching trial, the jury returned a swift verdict: guilty on all major counts. Jonas Eaton, then 53 years old, was sentenced to effectively life in prison, 6 consecutive life sentences plus additional years, ensuring he would never walk free. The judge, during sentencing, addressed the court and the survivors, saying, "What occurred at Eaton Hollow Creek is a stain on our conscience. The level of cruelty and control exercised was truly horrific, and it thrived in darkness. Today, that darkness has been dispelled by justice." Jonas himself stood stone-faced as he was led away. He offered no apology, muttering only a biblical verse about persecutors. His few remaining loyalists, including one son who still believed in him, shouted, "We forgive you, Jonas," as he exited, a final bizarre echo of the devotion he once commanded. The collapse of the Eaton Hollow Creek compound was complete. The truth, long buried in silence and secrecy, had finally been dragged into the light. But the end of the cult was not the end of the story for those who lived it. The aftermath, the healing, the questions, was only beginning. In the months and years following the rescue of the Eaton Hollow Creek survivors, a long and arduous process of healing began. The people who had once called the compound home were suddenly thrust into a world that most of them barely knew. For the children and teens, everything was new: schools, television, candy bars, cars on busy streets. It was as if they had stepped out of a time capsule. Social services, along with non-profit groups and trauma counselors, mobilized to support them. The children were placed with foster families or in group homes, and they underwent intensive therapy to address both the physical malnutrition and the deep psychological scars. Many of the younger kids adjusted remarkably well once they realized they were safe. They delighted in simple freedoms. One caseworker recalled a 7-year-old boy who was rescued being astonished that he could ask for seconds at dinner without fear. He had never had his fill of food before. For the adult survivors, adapting was more complicated. Most had no education beyond what Jonas provided, no employment history, and for some, no surviving family outside the cult. They leaned on each other, forming a kind of informal support network of ex-members navigating modern life. A few of the mothers were reunited with relatives who had searched for them for years. Those reunions were both joyous and painful as they confronted the lost time. Some marriages that had been arranged or strained under Jonas's rule dissolved in the aftermath, while other couples grew closer in shared healing. Tragically, not everyone managed to move forward. A couple of the older survivors, so institutionalized by decades under Jonas, struggled profoundly with depression and PTSD. One man in his 60s took his own life a year after the rescue, unable to find a sense of purpose outside the compound's now shattered world. Mental health professionals working with the group noted that many exhibited symptoms akin to prisoners of war or long-term hostages: nightmares, anxiety, difficulty making decisions, and a deep-seated fear of authority figures. Over time, however, many survivors did find hope and new beginnings. Sarah Miller, whose courageous escape had triggered the end, became something of a spokesperson, though she often said she didn't want fame. She cooperated with a documentary about the case and used the modest funds from it to attend college, studying psychology. "I want to help others like me," she said in an interview. "People who've been through the unspeakable and think no one will understand." Emily, the youngest bride, was taken in by a loving foster family who eventually adopted her. She changed her name and worked hard to build an identity beyond what Jonas tried to make her. In a televised interview a few years later, her adoptive mother noted with pride that Emily was finally learning how to be a kid. The broader community and authorities also engaged in reflection and reform. The state of Kentucky launched an inquiry into how such severe abuse could have gone undetected for so long. It led to some changes. For instance, tighter oversight of homeschooling, since Jonas had used lax homeschool laws to hide the children, and better interagency communication when red flags arise. The fact that multiple institutions, neighbors, churches, law enforcement, had missed the warning signs became a case study in the importance of vigilance. One of the lasting impacts was a push for training local officials to recognize cult-like dynamics and coercive control in families or groups. Eaton Hollow became a grim example used in seminars, illustrating how horror as normalcy allowed to continue can thrive when cloaked in silence and isolation. Yet, despite all that was uncovered, some mysteries remained. In the quiet aftermath of legal proceedings, a persistent question lingers. Did we uncover everything that happened in those woods, or were there more secrets buried forever? Some survivors believe there were indeed more victims, rumors of a stillborn baby in the early 90s whose burial place was never found, or whispers about a young man who disappeared after angering Jonas, possibly banished or worse. Extensive searches and investigations haven't confirmed additional crimes beyond those Jonas was charged with. But as one investigator put it, we probably have only their testimony to rely on for certain things. It's possible there are stories out there we'll never fully verify. Jonas Eaton himself has never admitted wrongdoing. In prison, he's reportedly an isolated figure. Other inmates, informed of his crimes, do not take kindly to child abusers. Ironically, Jonas lives now under a regimented control not entirely unlike what he imposed on others. He has no followers, no power, just long, empty days. In rare communications, he still insists he was doing God's work and that the world persecuted him for his faith. His lack of remorse only reaffirms to the survivors that leaving was their salvation. For those who survived Eaton Hollow Creek, moving on is a daily choice and a triumph. They have learned to laugh again, to make their own decisions, to raise their children without fear. Still, the legacy of what they endured will never fade completely. The Eaton Hollow case stands as a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a facade of piety and normalcy. It prompts an uncomfortable reflection for society. How many other quiet corners might conceal similar pain? Do we truly see our neighbors and intervene when something seems off, or do we look away out of respect for privacy, as happened for too long in this case? In the final reckoning, the Eaton Hollow Creek compound story is one of horror, but also of resilience. Those who were silenced found their voice. The powerful were held to account. The community that looked past them eventually became the community that rallied to support them. And today, the land where the compound once stood lies empty. Nature is reclaiming the fields. The old farmhouse has been demolished. There's talk of erecting a simple memorial there, perhaps a plaque in memory of the suffering that took place, and the lives rebuilt afterward. The dark chapter of Eaton Hollow Creek has closed, but it won't be forgotten. Do you believe every secret was uncovered, or did the world bury more than we'll ever know? That question haunts anyone who hears this tale. In the end, it urges vigilance and compassion, so that no such evil can so easily hide again. And if you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.